The first thing you have to do is to park the vehicle in a straight line, and after centering the steering wheel, lock it. How to center and lock the steering wheel? With the key in the on position, you turn the steering wheel until it is corner one side, and then mark the number of turns by returning to the opposite side until you jammed it. Once blocked on the opposite side, make half of the turns got to return to the center. Finally, once in the center, turn the key and remove it to the off or locked position. Then turn the steering wheel gently to the left until the perception of the immobilization of the steering wheel, which confirms the locking of it. Then loosen the front wheels of the car and lift it up if you haven't already done so. Do not forget to remove the steering rack and pinion. The right car must immobilized by jack stands or lifter if you have it. To operate cleanly without electrical shock to the vehicle, it is best to disconnect the battery after locking the steering wheel. Where is the battery and how to disconnect it from the car? Usually housed in one corner under the hood of the vehicle, you will see it attached by a mounting bracket. On some models of cars, such as the 2002 RAV4, you need to detach an opening at the bottom on the right side after lifting the hood to reach the battery. To disconnect the battery, simply disconnect the negative terminal first and replace it last. We disconnect most car battery by loosening the terminals using a 10 mm wrench. Here we go. It's time to remove the loads to disassemble the steering rack. Let's disconnect the steering column to steering pinion. Under the steering wheel behind the pedals, you'll find the lower column hole cover. Unscrew it with a 10 mm socket. Then slide it to the top of the part that content universal joint, then disconnect the lower joint to the intermediate shaft. To get the sliding movement of the steering assembly shaft, unscrew 2 screws at each end of this part, then make it slide by pulling with continuous upward vibrating force. Once detached steering assembly shaft from the intermediate shaft, do not remove the lower cover of the power steering column hole, so as not to forget it when reassembling, as it contains a silencer sheet that protects the assembly shaft lower joint from dirt. Now let's moving outside the vehicle. The steering knuckle attached to both ends of the steering rack by the tie rod's ends. Start by counting the number of tread that are on the inner tie rod exactly last the clamping nut that attaches it to the steering tie rod end. This number of threads will allow you to keep the initial length when reassembling a new tie rod end in case the old one has to be replaced. With the lock nut technique, use 2 wrenches to loosen the tie rod end with jam nut. Now begin by removing the cotter pin and nut that attaches the tie rod to the steering knuckle. After loosening the nut, leave it to the end of the thread. If you do not have a universal tie rod end puller, tap the side of the steering knuckle closest to the tie rod ends with a hammer until the part loosens, then finish removing the nut from the thread. Do the same for the opposite side. My problem with this steering rack is a crushed mounting support bushings, which causes vibration to the steering wheel, especially when turning on the highway. To solve this kind of problem, I either changed its support bushings or changed the whole steering rack. Personally, I wouldn't recommend to fix a steering rack by repair kit either. So let's continue with the steering rack disassembly. After releasing the steering rack to the steering column and wheel, we need to remove other loads, such as unscrewing the screws on the steering rack that support the return tube and the feed tube. Be aware that the return tube differs from the pressure feed tube by clamps on the length of this tube and their mounting position up and down. How to disassemble the hoses to the steering rack. With a long nose pliers, pinch the clamp closest to the end of the return tube hose and pull it back farther onto the tube. You need to provide a container to collect the oil from both hoses, and then, once done, remove the return tube hose with vibrating movements. Avoid pulling it out with screwdrivers to avoid damaging the hose. Use WD-40 for steering mounting bolts and the pressure feed tube nut. If, like me, you are working on a 2002 RAV4, remove the pressure feed tube to the steering rack with a 17mm wrench. Once you removed all the loads, unscrew the steering rack support bolts to bring it back out its compartment. Please be aware that I am not responsible for not following the safety instructions, which can cause serious injury. Please do your own research. Good repair, guys. If I do it myself, you can too.